Good evening. Welcome to the lesson number 12 of the Old Testament Made Simple, putting it all together. What we've been doing over the last several weeks is a study by Mr. Melton Short called The Old Testament Made Simple. Mr. Short's from Clanton, Alabama. We became familiar with him when we were overseas in Belize, became familiar with this study, and have used it on multiple occasions. And I hope you have been enjoying the lessons up until this point. And tonight, we want to again talk about the 8 trips through the Old Testament that gives us a skeleton view of the Old Testament. We don't have all the meat, the tendons, the skin, but we have a skeleton view, the bones, basically, of the Old Testament. So far, we have taken 8 trips through the Old Testament. We first looked at the geographical moves of the children of Israel throughout the Old Testament. We've looked at the 20 key people of the Old Testament. We looked at the 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. We looked at the 11 books that contain 95% of the story of the Old Testament. We looked at a way to remember the content of each of the 39 books of the Old Testament. We looked at God's 7 major covenants with the children of Israel and mankind. We looked at the 5 major time periods of the Old Testament. And lastly, we looked at the 50 major events. Now, I would encourage you to go back, if you're having trouble with any particular section, go back and pick up one of the videos from YouTube and rewatch it. That'll help you recall the information and help you bring it to the forefront of your thinking so that you will have it with you from today forward. We look at our map. We try to label our room. If you look at the corner in the left of your room, this body of water is called the Persian Gulf. The city just to the north is called This is the Fertile Crescent, the land up around the room to the back corner on your right. And this body of water that would be outside the wall of your room is the Mediterranean Sea. Just to the south is the nation of Egypt, and the nation just back inside the Fertile Crescent is called Israel. Now, we've been naming the rivers. The river to the north is the Tigris River. The river to the south in the Fertile Crescent is the Euphrates River. And the river in Israel that flows from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea is the Jordan River. Those are the 3 major rivers we have discussed in our geography of the Old Testament. Now, as the children of Israel left Egypt, they crossed a body of water. This is called the Red Sea. As they crossed the Red Sea, they came to Mount Sinai. It was on Mount Sinai that Moses received the 10 Commandments. As the children of Israel traveled around in this area, the land in the center of your room to the back is the desert. They stopped here where the new generation was trained in a land called Moab before going back into the promised land. Now, the children of Israel were taken captive at a period of time for 70 years by King Nebuchadnezzar, and they were taken to the city of Babylon, right here on the Euphrates River, located between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Now, where did it all begin? It all began right here in Eden. There's a little place right up here where Abraham moved called Haran. And that's the basic geography of the children of Israel in the Fertile Crescent. Now, we had 7 major moves of the children of Israel course, everything began in Eden, so our first move was from Eden to down here just north of the Persian Gulf. God spoke to Abraham and told him to move away from his people to a land that God would show him. And so he moved from up the Euphrates River to Haran. After the death of his father Terah in Haran, Abraham continued to follow the Lord's direction for move number 3, which was from Haran down into Israel. Now, move number 4, Joseph carried them into Egypt. And there, Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt, became second only to Pharaoh. Famine in the land, and Jacob, Joseph's dad, and his brothers were allowed to move into Egypt. And there, God grew the children of Israel into a large nation. So move number 5 was from Egypt, back through the desert, back to Israel. Move number 6 was from Israel as they were taken captive to Babylon. And then move number 7 was from Babylon back to Israel. And that gets the major moves of the children of Israel on the map. Now here we have the 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. We have 17 historical books, 17 prophetical books, and 5 poetry books sandwiched in the middle to form the letter H. Now, we have 5 books of the Old Testament. The first 5 books are the law, also called the Pentateuch. And then we have 12 other historical books. We have 5 poetry books. We have 5 major prophets. And then we have 12 minor prophets. So as we name the books of the Bible, we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That is the Pentateuch. And then the 12 other books are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then Esther. The 5 books of poetry are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And then our 5 major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And these are the 5 major prophets. And then we have Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And that's our 39 books of the Old Testament. If you learn them via the 3 major divisions of the Old Testament, putting them into categories 5, 5, 5, 12, 12, you can begin to get an understanding of the books of the Old Testament. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to put it all together. And the way we're going to put it all together tonight is by time periods. And the time period before Israel became a nation. Okay, now this would be before they went to Egypt, so before they became a nation. Let's look at the key people. Now, our 6 key people are Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Those were our 6 key people during the time period before Israel became a nation. Now, they had some major moves during this time period. And, of course, the first move was from Eden to Then we had from to Haran. Move number 3 was from Haran to Israel. Move number 4 was from Israel to Egypt. All of this occurred before Israel became a nation. Now we had four major covenants. Covenants were agreements that God made with mankind. The first covenant God made was the Edenic covenant. If the man would not eat from the tree in the center of the garden, they would be able to live and exist and have fellowship with God. They broke that covenant, and so God formed a new covenant with them called the Adamic covenant. Through the Adamic covenant, there would be pain with childbirth. Uh, Man would have to work for his food. The land would be cursed. There would be fear between the animals and man. And thorns and thistles would grow up on the earth. And then after the Adamic covenant, mankind continued to flourish on the earth, became very wicked and very evil. So God made a covenant with another man, the Noahic covenant. God told Noah to build a boat. We call it the ark. And he and his family would be saved on the ark, as well as the animals from across the face of the earth. So Noah found favor in God's eyes, and God said, I'll start over with you, Noah, and we'll replenish the earth. And that's exactly what God did. He flooded the entire world, and everything that was not on the ark of the land dwelling animals and people all perished. Then we have the Abrahamic covenant. God selected the man Abraham in the city of Ur and had him move out of Ur and move toward Israel. And God said through Abraham that I will make you a great nation. And number two, I will bless all families of the earth through your seed. So that became the Abrahamic covenant. We find that in the midway of the Bible, time-wise, which is Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. That's the middle of the Bible, time-wise. Now, we're going to look at the major events of this time period before Israel became a nation. So, first of all, we have creation, the 7 days of creation. We've been studying this in our other Sunday school literature during the time of this recording. And we know that God created the earth in 6 literal days and rested on the seventh. The next was, of course, the fall of man. Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden. They ate from the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God forced them to leave out of the garden and placed a curse upon man and the earth as a result of that sin. The next major event was the flood. Noah and the ark and all the animals that were saved on the ark. Then we have the beginning of languages, which is the Tower of Babel, believed to be in and around the ancient Babylon that we talk about in the Bible. So the beginning of languages occurred at the Tower of Babel. God came down and confused their languages and moved them to all parts of the world. Then we have the call of Abraham in the city of Ur. Then we have the birth of his son Isaac and the birth of Isaac's son Jacob. Then we have Jacob's children. After Jacob's name changes to Israel, he becomes Israel instead of Jacob. And then he has 12 sons. Those 12 sons are later going to become a nation. Okay? Joseph, one of his sons, was sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers because they were jealous. You'll read the story of Joseph in the coat of many colors and Joseph the dreamer. He was sold into slavery in Egypt, but God used that as an opportunity to bring Jacob's family during a time of famine into Egypt. And so Jacob moves to Egypt. This all before Israel became a nation. Okay? Now, what book did this occur in? If you go back to the contents of the books, we know that in the book of Genesis, the first 5 words are in the beginning, God created, and the last 5 words are in a coffin in Egypt. So in a coffin in Egypt, of course, was Joseph. So all of before Israel became a nation, we'll find in the book of Genesis. And that finishes that time period. Now let's move to the next time period, Israel in Egypt. Now it's during this time period that Jacob's family of 70 becomes a nation of 2.4 million people. So they grow quite a bit while they are in Egypt. God uses this opportunity to make a great nation out of Abraham. Who are the key people during this time period? They are Moses and they are Pharaoh. That's our key people during this time period. What major move is begun during this period? Egypt back to Israel. Move number 5 is begun during this time period. What leader do we see during this time period? Moses. Moses is born during this time period and becomes a major leader of the children of Israel. Now, the major events of this particular time period: Jacob's family becomes a nation, like I said, from 70 to 2.4 million. Then there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. Now, see, Joseph was second only to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh dreamed dreams, and Joseph interpreted those dreams to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh put Joseph over the 7 years of plenty to harvest grain and to store that grain, so that during the 7 years of famine, Egypt would have plenty of grain. It's during that 7 years of famine that Jacob moved his family in to the nation of Egypt, and they stayed there for over 400 years. During that 400-year period of time, there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph. And as a result of that, he saw this large group of people living within his borders, and he became fearful of the nation of Israel. He became fearful of the Hebrews, as they were called. So he began having all of the male children killed at birth by throwing them into the Nile River. Well, there was a young man born during this period of time. His name was Moses. The story goes, Moses in the bulrushes. His mom placed him in a basket, pushed the basket out into the Nile River, close to where Pharaoh's daughter would go to bathe. Pharaoh's daughter saw the baby, had compassion on him, adopted him as her own child, and moved him into the palace. So Moses is born. He's raised in the palace. He spends most of his first 40 years in the palace. Then he begins to notice the Hebrews and the persecution they're faced with under Pharaoh and the things that are happening to them. And he began to have compassion on the Hebrews and actually killed an Egyptian. And as a result of killing the Egyptian, he went into hiding in the land of Midian, and there he stayed for an extensive period of time. While there, he had an encounter with God at the burning bush. The bush burned with fire but was not consumed, and God spoke to Moses through the burning bush and told him he wanted him to go back into Egypt. So God sends Moses back to Pharaoh to have the children of Israel released so that they could go into the desert and worship God. This brings on the 10 plagues in Egypt because Pharaoh did not want to let the children of Israel go, so God put 10 plagues upon them. The last of those plagues is the death of everything firstborn, the death of the firstborn child, the death of the firstborn animals. Whatever was firstborn would die as a result of the 10th plague, and the only ones that were saved were those that had taken a lamb, sacrificed the lamb according to God's plan, and placed its blood upon their doorsill. If they did that, then the death angel, when it moved through Egypt to kill all of the firstborn, would pass over their homes. And that became the Passover feast and the Passover celebration that is still celebrated in Israel today, the Passover. was the blood applied to the door sill. The death angel did not bother anyone in that home, and they were spared. As a result of the 10th plague, Pharaoh decided to let God's people go. And so Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, 2.4 million people, into the desert, and that is called the Exodus. Where do we find all of this that occurred in Egypt? We find it in the book of Exodus. All right, let's look at our third time period. The name of this time period is Israel in the wilderness. Now, during this period of time, we have one major key person, and that is Moses. Moses leads the children of Israel during this entire time period. This time period is about 40 years. There's only one major move, and it's really just in progress, and that's Egypt to Israel. It's just in progress during this 40-year period of time. What major covenant do we see here? Well, Moses received the 10 Commandments. God actually spoke to the children of Israel and spoke to them the 10 Commandments. He later wrote those on tablets for Moses, and that is called the Mosaic Covenant. And God has told us throughout time since then that if man would live by the commandments and be obedient to him, he would have fellowship with them. Israel had one main leader during this period of time. Now, this starts us into what we call the tribal period of time. As tribes, they would have a leader over the 12 tribes. Well, during this period of time, the leader is Moses. And Moses leads the children of Israel through the wilderness. Now, the major events, first off, right after leaving Egypt, they're given the 10 Commandments. Moses receives the law at Mount Sinai. God has them build the tabernacle, which is a place where God would dwell with his people. His presence was visible over the tabernacle as a cloud by day and as a fire by night. So God was visible over the tabernacle, and that was their place of worship, their place of sacrifice to God. They got to the land of Canaan, which was Israel, the promised land that God had promised Abraham generations before. They sent in 12 spies, one from each of the 12 tribes. Only 2 spies came back and said, we can take the land. The remaining 10 said, the people are too big, the cities are fortified, there's no way we can conquer this land. The 2 that said yes was Joshua and Caleb, and they would be the only 2 that would be allowed to enter the land of Canaan 40 years later after the wilderness wanderings. All the other adults would die in the wilderness and would not be allowed to enter the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb would be allowed to enter. So as a result of the 12 spies, 10 coming back saying, no, we can't, the people revolted against God, and God forced them into the wilderness to wander for 40 years. After the older generation died, they arrived at Moab, ready to go back into the promised land, and it's there that Moses taught afresh the law in the book of Deuteronomy to the new generation. So the new generation was taught at Moab. And then Joshua succeeds Moses as the next leader into the next time period. Now, this is found the last part of Exodus and the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers was the 2 census. One was taken right after they left Egypt. One was taken right before they entered Israel again from the land of Moab. And that gets us the time period of Israel in the wilderness. Now we're going to the height of the Hebrew civilization, if you will, the time of Israel's greatest success, the time that God was blessing the children of Israel and would have done great things with them, but they refused to obey God. But the key people during this period of time, of course, is first Joshua. He led the children of Israel in. Following Joshua, we had the 12 judges. Following the 12 judges, we have Samuel. Following Samuel, we have the first king. The people rejected Samuel and his sons, didn't want them to rule over them. They wanted a king instead. This broke Samuel's heart, and he didn't want to anoint a king, but God said, because the people have asked for a king, I will give them a king. This was the last of the tribal leaders. Samuel was the last of the tribal leaders, and then we had the kings. Saul was the first king anointed. David was the second king anointed. Solomon was the third king anointed. After Solomon sinned in his later years, and God said, I'll leave the kingdom intact as long as you're alive, but after your death, I'm going to split the kingdom. And he split the kingdom, and then we have 39 kings of the divided kingdom. And we'll go over the kingdoms in just a moment. But the kingdom split in two. We had Israel in the north, and we had Judah in the south, and we had 39 kings of this divided kingdom. And then the last of the key people during this period of time are the prophets that's going to preach during this period of time. All right, there were no major moves. Israel was at home. Their borders were expanding. Their cities and their civilization was developing, and all was good in the land of Israel for a period of time. The major covenant during this period of time was the Davidic covenant. David wanted to build a house for God. During his kingship, God still dwelt in the tabernacle, which was a tent. David had a house made out of cedar, and so he desired to build God a house. Well, David was a soldier and a general, had blood on his hands, if you will, as he had defeated many enemies. And so God did not allow David to build his temple, but he told David he would allow his son to build the temple to him. And so Solomon builds the first temple to God, the actual, if you will, a church structure where the children of Israel would worship God. Solomon built it, and it was magnificent, an incredible structure. But because David loved God and wanted God to have a house, God told David that he would always have an heir on the throne. And that was completely fulfilled with Jesus Christ, as he was a descendant of David and has died to be our eternal king. He's alive today, sitting at the right hand of the Father, making intercessions for each and every one of us. The leaders during this time period, of course, first was Joshua. He succeeded Moses and became the next leader of Israel during the tribal period. After Joshua, there were the 12 judges. We'll talk more about the sin cycle in just a moment. Then there was Samuel. Samuel was the last judge and a prophet, if you will. Following Samuel, we had kings, Saul, then David, then Solomon, and then we had the 39 kings of the divided kingdom to finish out Israel's leaders during this time period. Now, the major events that occurred during this time period, the first major event was from the land of Moab as they crossed the Jordan River into Israel. Joshua led the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, and they began to conquer the promised land that God had given them. The land was divided amongst the 12 tribes, and God told them to subdue the land, take over, get rid of all of the enemies that are there, and I will bless you. I will take care of you. Then we have a period of time of sin and separation from God. We call this the time of the judges. We'll look at the sin cycle in just a moment. But this is a period of time that the children of Israel, they would do good for a little while, then they would sin, then God would send an oppressor, they would cry out to God, God would give them a judge, the judge would deliver them. As long as the judge lived, they would serve God, and then boom, all of it would start all over again. During this period of time, Ruth follows Naomi from the land of Midian back into Canaan to follow Naomi's God and to be with Naomi in serving God. And so Ruth moves back in. Then we have the ministry of Samuel. Following the judges, we have Samuel. Then we have Israel demands a king. They don't want Samuel's sons to reign over them, and they demand a king. Then we have Saul, who's anointed as the first king. Saul stood head and shoulders above everyone else and was a very stately fellow, and he was chosen to be the king. But Saul proved not to be such a good king, so David becomes the next king. David was a man after God's own heart. Many stories about David. David and Goliath. David killing the lion. David killing the bear. David running from Saul. Just great stories about David becoming king. And then his son Solomon was the wisest king that Israel ever had. He served at the period of time that Israel was at the height of their glory. He built God's first temple there in Jerusalem, and it was magnificent, covered with gold. To see it, you and I would not be able to imagine its splendor. It was so great and so magnificent. Solomon was a very wise man and led well for a period of time. But toward the end of his reign, he began to drift away from God. God told Solomon, after your death, I'm going to split the kingdom. And as a result of splitting the kingdom, we're going to have a north and a south. Solomon built God's temple, and then the kingdom divided. You have, during the king period, you have the ministry of Elijah, and you have the ministry of Elisha. Two great prophets, great stories in 1 Kings for Elijah, 2 Kings for Elisha. And then lastly here, we have the prophets that began to preach to the children of Israel toward the end of this period of time as Israel begins to stray away from God, as we move into the period of the 39 kings of the divided kingdom, the north and the south. We see these prophets preaching their heart out, but the children of Israel were not listening. The historical books that we find this time period in is Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. All right. Now, let's take a look at that sin cycle that we have talked about this whole thing. And I want you to fully understand that this is how sin works in our lives today. This is what the devil tries to do to each and every one of us. This cycle was repeated several times during a 400-year period of time under the judges. One, they would stray away from God. We do this. We sin. We let the devil get the best of us, and we stray away from God. God allows, for the children of Israel, he would allow an enemy nation to come in and oppress them, like the Philistines or the Midianites, or some other group would come in and cause Israel all kinds of problems. And they would then cry out to God. They would ask for forgiveness. Anytime you and I stray and God tries to get our attention, God's wanting us to repent. Now, Satan here wants us to rebel. And so Satan wants to cause us to get out of this cycle and to spiral out of control and end up in hell. So God wants, as a result of oppression, as a result of his disciplining us, he wants us to repent. That's his desire. And so the children of Israel, they would cry out to God, repent of their sins. God would raise up a leader or a judge, and this judge would bring deliverance to the children of Israel. He would reestablish the worship of God and do the things that were supposed to be done. God would forgive the people, and there would be a period of time that everything would go really good. As long as that leader lived, everything would be kind of good. The children of Israel would do what they were supposed to. Well, maybe that leader would die, and as a result of the death, they would begin to drift away from God again, and lo and behold, they'd stray away. We have to be careful of this very cycle in our own lives today, not to get tangled up with Satan and not to spiral out of control. But when God brings on his persecution, we need to repent and be sure that we're moving in this direction to stay in fellowship with God. We had the comparison of the two nations. After Solomon's death, we had 39 kings of the divided kingdom. The divided kingdom was divided between the north and the south. Israel was the name of the north, Judah was the name of the south. We had 10 tribes in the north, we have 2 tribes in the south. We had Samaria as the capital in the north, Jerusalem as the capital in the south. God's temple was at Jerusalem. There were 19 kings of Israel, 20 kings of Judah. Out of Israel's kings, there were no good kings whatsoever. Out of Judah's kings, there were 8 that were good kings. That's very important for us to understand and to see. All right, now we move into the last period of time. I told you the prophets preached, and they tried to get Israel to repent of their sins. They tried to get them to do what was right. They did everything they could to encourage the children of Israel. So we have key people here. First, of course, is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who is going to create the exile to start with. He's going to come in and take over Judah. Now, Israel in the north had already been destroyed before this period of time. They were actually destroyed at the end of our last period of time. So here we have the exile, Nebuchadnezzar. We have the prophets that are preaching and trying to encourage people. And then we have the beyond. After the exile, we have leaders, Zerubbabel, who was a key person, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These were key individuals during this time period. Major moves is from Israel to Babylon, and from Babylon back to Israel. The new covenant itself is in the New Testament, but was referred to many times in the Old Testament. So if we have a major covenant during this period of time, it's the new covenant that's being talked about through the prophets as they talk about the Messiah and the work of the Messiah and what the Messiah would do. And we, of course, know that to be Jesus Christ and the work that he did. The leaders during this period of time were after the exile. During the exile, we don't have a leader, but after the exile, leading the return back to Jerusalem is first Zerubbabel, who leads the first return, Ezra, who leads the second return, and Nehemiah, who leads the last return. Zerubbabel helps to rebuild the temple, Ezra helps to rebuild the priesthood, and Nehemiah helps to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Major events that occurred during this time period. First off, Assyria scatters Israel. Israel is totally defeated, and they're scattered throughout the known world, sold into slavery, and scattered all over the place. Babylon then carries Judah captive, the southern nation of Judah, 2 tribes, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. They're carried captive to Babylon. They're in Babylon in the exile for 70 years. Then following that, during that period of time in the exile, Ezekiel has his visions of the end of time. The 3 Hebrew children are thrown into the fiery furnace. A 4th person appears, one like the Son of Man, and Son of God, I'm sorry. We believe that to be Jesus Christ himself, who walked with the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace, and they were freed from the furnace and did not even smell of smoke on their clothing. The miracle that God provided there. Then we have Daniel in the lion's den. Great story. Then we have Persia overthrowing Babylon. This brought on some kings that were more supportive of the Hebrews and began to allow the Hebrews, the tribe of Judah, their descendants, to begin returning back to Jerusalem. So the Persians were more open to this return to start back the city of Jerusalem. Esther, during this period of time, becomes a queen and saves her people. The nation of Israel still celebrates the holiday Purim as a result of the work of Queen Esther. Remember Esther, if I perish, I perish. She went before the king and spoke for her people and allowed her people to be saved that were in exile in Babylon. Following Esther and the return, the beyond, we have three prophets that preached after the exile: Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And these guys talked to the children of Israel, encouraging them to rebuild the temple and to restore fellowship with God following the exile. And then we have the silent years after Malachi, who's the last book in the Old Testament. There's over 400 years that there is not a prophet in Israel, no message from God. And then we have the birth of Jesus Christ to finish out the major events of the exile and beyond. Now, what books do we find this information in? Second Kings, the last part, we pick up part of the story. Then we have Ezra, as we have the stories of Zerubbabel and the story of Ezra. And then we have Nehemiah, the story of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And we'll also find some information in Daniel and in the book of Ezekiel. And so that completes our 5 time periods. That completes our major events, our leaders, our covenants, our moves, and our key people, as well as the historical books that contain 95% of the narrative of the Old Testament. I encourage you to review the books of the Old Testament. The easy way to remember the contents of the books of the Old Testament from previous lessons: go back, look at the contents of each of the books of the Old Testament. Remember the 17 historical books. Look at those. Those tell the story. Get the information from them. The 5 poetical books. Those are and look at the contents of each of those. Then we have the 5 major prophets. The last 3 major prophets preached during the exile. The last 3 minor prophets preached after the exile, and everybody else preached before the exile. Go back and review the when and the who, and remember the who did they preach to. Most all of them preached to the nation of Israel. To the nation of Judah. Very few of them preached to the nation of Israel. The ones that did not preach to Judah, there's only 5 of them out of the 17 prophets. Only 5 did not preach to Judah. And those 5, if you look at the first letter of the name of the book, it spells out the word Jonah. So J is for Jonah, O is for Obadiah, N is for Nahum, A is for Amos, H is for Hosea. Those 5 prophets preached to someone other than Judah. Everybody else preached to Judah. So go back and review the contents of the books from a previous lesson, and until that is firmly in your mind, so that if a preacher spits out the name of a book in the Old Testament, you've got a general idea of what's in that particular book. Thank you for being a part of this series. I hope you have gained some information. I hope it has been a blessing to you. Please review past lessons on YouTube as often as necessary. We're going to leave these lessons up on YouTube. You can look for my YouTube account. It's Jeffrey Boyles on YouTube. And you can look for the Old Testament Made Simple lessons, and you'll find all of the lessons that we have gone through in this series. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've picked something up, and I hope you're able to go through the entire Old Testament in skeleton form. Have a good evening.